I never set out to be a hero, or a troublemaker, or anything in between. For most of my life, my primary goal has been to be left alone to do my work, pay my bills, and enjoy the quiet hum of a well-maintained engine. My name is Jack, and I own a small landscaping and snow removal business. It's a good life. It's honest work that leaves you tired at the end of the day in a way that feels earned. For 10 years, I'd lived in a community called Whispering Pines, a name that was perhaps a bit too poetic for a straightforward collection of suburban houses, but it was peaceful. The name matched the vibe. We were a neighborhood of quiet nods, polite waves, and the unspoken agreement to mind our own business. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association was, for most of those 10 years, a ghost. It existed on paper, a relic from when the development was first built. We all paid our modest annual dues, which covered the landscaping for the small patch of green at the entrance and not much else. The president was an old fellow named Mr. Harris, a retiree whose primary presidential duty seemed to be cashing the dues checks and then disappearing back into his garden for another year. Meetings were a formality held once a year in the community clubhouse, and they were usually attended by Mr. Harris, his wife, and maybe one other person who had forgotten it was Tuesday. It was perfect. The HOA was a benign entity that allowed us to live our lives without interference. It was a system that worked because it did almost nothing. Then, about 3 years ago, Brenda moved in. She bought the 2-story colonial on the corner lot, the one with the immaculate lawn that always looked like it was chemically enhanced. Brenda was a woman in her late 50s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed, unnaturally blonde hair and a gaze that could curdle milk. She radiated an aura of perpetual dissatisfaction, as if the world was constantly failing to meet her very specific and unyielding standards. She was, from the moment she arrived, a joiner. She didn't just want to live in the community, she wanted to run it. Her timing was, in retrospect, tragically perfect. A few months after she moved in, old Mr. Harris passed away peacefully in his sleep. His passing left a power vacuum in the HOA that nobody else wanted. At the annual meeting that year, attendance was at its usual record low at me, because I'd promised my wife I'd go for once, a couple who had just moved in and didn't know any better, and Brenda. She arrived with a binder, a laminated agenda, and a speech. She spoke of community standards, protecting property values, and restoring order. It all sounded vaguely impressive and incredibly boring. When it came time to nominate a new president, she nominated herself. No one else wanted the job. We voted her in just to get the meeting over with so we could go home and watch television. It was the single most consequential and regrettable vote of my life. The changes started subtly. First, it was a newsletter, printed on expensive cardstock and filled with dense, single-spaced text. It outlined new rules, citing obscure bylaws from the original 1980s charter that no one had ever read. Our trash and recycling bins, which for decades had been dutifully placed at the curb on Tuesday nights, now had to be stored in a location not visible from the street at all other times. This sent people scrambling to find space in their already cramped garages. Then came the mailbox decree. All mailbox posts had to be painted a Whispering Pines beige, a specific shade that could only be purchased from one hardware store 30 minutes away. A sample color chip was included in the newsletter. These early rules were met with a collective groan. We were a community of practical people, and this felt like a solution in search of a problem. But it was easier to comply than to fight. We moved our trash cans. We painted our mailboxes. We grumbled to each other while getting the mail, but no one wanted to be the one to challenge Brenda. She had an unnerving habit of walking the neighborhood with a clipboard and a measuring tape, making notes. She was the walking, talking embodiment of a complaint waiting to happen. The atmosphere of quiet cooperation began to curdle into one of quiet anxiety. You'd find yourself looking at your own lawn and wondering if your grass was a quarter of an inch too high, or if that bird feeder was in violation of some new, unannounced ordinance. Brenda wasn't just the HOA president, she was the neighborhood's self-appointed warden. The inciting incident, the spark that lit the long, slow-burning fuse of my conflict with Brenda, arrived in the form of a blizzard. It wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a meteorological event, the kind they give names to on the news. They called it the snowpocalypse, and for once, the hyperbole was justified. It started on a Friday afternoon and didn't stop for 36 hours. When the skies finally cleared on Sunday morning, we were buried under nearly 3 feet of dense, heavy snow. The world was silent, white, and completely immobile. The city's plows were overwhelmed, focusing only on the main arteries. Residential streets like ours were on their own. For me, a storm like this was a mixed bag. On one hand, it was a logistical nightmare. On the other, it was job security. My business had contracts with several commercial lots, strip malls, doctors' offices, a small factory, and they needed to be cleared. I spent the better part of 2 days and nights in the cab of my Ford F-350 with the big commercial-grade plow on the front, fueled by lukewarm coffee from a thermos and an endless cycle of classic rock on the radio. It was grueling, exhausting work, but it was what I did. By Monday morning, my clients were cleared, and I was finally heading home, bone-tired but satisfied. Our street, like all the others in Whispering Pines, was impassable. I saw my neighbors struggling, trying to clear the massive berms at the end of their driveways with little more than plastic shovels. I saw Mrs. Gable, my next-door neighbor, an elderly widow in her 80s, peering out her front window with a worried look on her face. I knew she had a nurse who visited daily, and there was no way that nurse's Toyota was getting through this. So I did what any decent neighbor would do. I lowered my plow and got to work. I cleared the main path of our street first, creating a lane wide enough for a car to pass. Then I cleared the entrance to each driveway, including my own. I paid special attention to Mrs. Gable's, making sure her entire driveway and walkway were clear right to her front door. It took me another 2 hours, but when I was done, our little section of the world was functional again. I didn't ask for a dime. It was just the right thing to do. I was in my kitchen, finally enjoying a hot cup of coffee and feeling the satisfying ache in my muscles, when I saw her. Brenda, trudging through the snow path I'd just created, wearing a bright pink parka and a look of thunderous fury. She wasn't heading for her own house, she was marching directly towards mine. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I opened the door before she could knock. The cold air hit my face. "Jack," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any pleasantries. She was holding a clipboard, partially protected from the elements by a clear plastic sleeve. Even in a blizzard, the clipboard was her scepter of authority. "Brenda," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Can I help you?" "You are in violation of multiple community bylaws," she announced, as if reading from a stone tablet. Section 7, Paragraph C of the Whispering Pines Covenants explicitly prohibits the operation of commercial-grade equipment on community-maintained roadways for non-sanctioned purposes. I blinked, genuinely confused. "I was just clearing the street, Brenda." "So people could get out," I gestured towards Mrs. Gable's house. "Mrs. Gable needs her nurse to be able to get to her. Her nurse's access is a personal matter for her to resolve with the city," Brenda snapped back, her eyes narrowing. "It does not give you the right to operate an unlicensed, uninsured commercial enterprise in our neighborhood. You are not the community's designated snow removal contractor." "Contractor?" "I didn't charge anyone a cent," I said, my patience starting to fray. "I was helping my neighbors." "Your intent is irrelevant," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The bylaws are clear. Furthermore," she continued, consulting her clipboard, "your snow piles are in violation of Regulation 12B regarding snow containment. All snow removed from roadways must be deposited in designated green spaces and must not exceed a height of 4 feet. Your pile at the end of the cul-de-sac is at least 6 feet high and is encroaching on a common area." I stared at her, dumbfounded. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it was breathtaking. We were in the middle of a state of emergency, and she was out here with a clipboard, measuring snow piles. "Brenda, there are no designated green spaces. They're under 3 feet of snow." Where was I supposed to put it? In my pocket. Her face tightened. She hated being questioned. She hated sarcasm even more. "Your failure to plan is not the board's problem. Rules are rules," Jack. They are what separate us from chaos. She tore a piece of paper from her clipboard. It was already damp from the cold. This is your official notice of violation. You are being fined $100 for the unauthorized use of commercial equipment. Consider this your only warning. If you do it again, the fines will increase exponentially. She thrust the paper at me. I took it, the wet pulp cold against my fingers. I looked from the paper to her face, a mask of smug righteousness. I tried one last time to appeal to reason. This is ridiculous. The entire street was blocked. I helped everyone. You broke the rules, she repeated, her voice flat and final. Pay the fine within 30 days. With that, she turned and marched back down the path I had cleared for her, a small, pink tyrant in a world of white. I stood in my doorway, holding the ridiculous piece of paper, the warmth of my kitchen at my back and the cold, unreasonable reality of Brenda in front of me. The blizzard was over, but I had a feeling the storm was just beginning. I held onto the violation notice for a week, certain it was a bad joke. I half expected Brenda to come to her senses, to realize how completely unhinged it was to fine someone for helping an elderly neighbor during a record-breaking snowstorm. I was wrong. My optimism was profoundly naive. Brenda did not operate on the same plane of logic and reason as the rest of humanity. I decided the best course of action was to treat it as the absurdity it was. I threw it in the trash. I figured that if she was serious, she'd have to send something more official, something through the mail. I was not going to dignify her clipboard crusade with a response. Exactly 31 days later, a crisp white envelope arrived. It bore the Whispering Pines HOA logo, which Brenda had redesigned to feature a more aggressive-looking pine tree. Inside was a letter, typed in a severe-looking font. It was a second notice. My original fine of $100 was now past due. A $25 late fee had been appended. My new total was $125. The letter was signed, in a sharp, angular script, Brenda Miller, President. This, I decided, required a response. I was still convinced that this could be solved with simple communication. I sat down and wrote a calm, respectful letter to the HOA board. I laid out the facts of the situation, the unprecedented nature of the snowstorm, the paralysis of city services, the fact that I was providing a necessary service to my neighbors free of charge, with a particular emphasis on the needs of Mrs. Gable. I pointed out that the bylaw she cited was clearly intended to prevent someone from, say, running an auto repair shop out of their driveway, not to punish a resident for an act of community service. I formally requested that the board review the circumstances and waive the fine and the associated late fee. I mailed it to the HOA's post office box, feeling confident that the other two board members, a quiet man named Frank and a woman I barely knew named Susan, would see reason. 2 weeks later, the response came. It was another letter from Brenda. It stated, in cold, bureaucratic language, that the board has reviewed your appeal and found it to be without merit. It informed me that the fine was upheld and that, as my payment was now even later, another $25 late fee had been added. The total was now $150. The letter ended with a chilling sentence: further delays in payment will result in the accrual of additional penalties and may lead to the initiation of collections proceedings, including the placement of a lien on your property. A lien? On my house. Over $100 fine for plowing snow. The ground had shifted beneath my feet. This wasn't just a squabble with a power-tripping neighbor anymore. This was a direct threat to my home and my financial stability. My frustration began to simmer, slowly heating into a quiet rage. I started talking to my neighbors, something I hadn't done much before. I wanted to know if I was alone in this. I wasn't. Arthur, a retired history professor who lived across the street, told me he'd been fined $50 because the shutters on his house had faded to a shade of green that Brenda deemed inconsistent with the approved community palette. He had received the violation notice the day after his wife's funeral. He'd been too grief-stricken to deal with it, and now his fine was also accruing late fees. The Millers, a young couple down the street, were in a battle with her over the small vegetable garden they'd planted in their backyard. Brenda claimed it constituted agricultural activity, which was forbidden. They were being fined on a weekly basis. The most heartbreaking story came from Mrs. Gable herself. I went over to check on her one afternoon, and she seemed distressed. After some gentle prodding, she showed me a letter she'd received. Brenda had fined her $25. The violation? A small sticker on her front window, no bigger than a credit card, that indicated she had a medical alert system. Brenda had classified it as an unapproved commercial advertisement. Mrs. Gable was on a fixed income, and the fine, small as it was, worried her deeply. But more than that, she felt targeted, harassed for being old and needing help. It became clear that Brenda was running the HOA not as a community service, but as her own personal fiefdom. She was a bully, plain and simple, using the bylaws as a weapon to intimidate and control her neighbors. Most people were too scared or too worn down to fight back. They just paid the fines to make her go away. But her threat of a lien had changed the calculus for me. I wasn't just going to roll over. This had become a matter of principle. Month after month, the notices kept coming. Each one added another $25 late fee, and soon, Brenda invented new charges: administrative processing fee, account delinquency fee, legal notice preparation fee. The original $100 fine was a distant memory. It ballooned from $150 to $200, then $300, then $500. It crossed the $1,000 mark without slowing down. The letters became more aggressive, written in language that was clearly lifted from a debt collector's handbook. They spoke of wage garnishment and foreclosure. It was a campaign of systematic, bureaucratic terror. When the bill hit $1,500, I knew I was out of my depth. I couldn't fight this with polite letters anymore. I needed professional help. I looked up attorneys specializing in real estate and property law and found a man named David Thompson. His office was in a modest brick building downtown. He was in his 60s, with a calm demeanor, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and eyes that had seen it all. I sat in his office, laying out the whole sordid story, from the snowstorm to the latest threatening letter. I handed him the thick file of correspondence I had meticulously kept. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his face unreadable. When I was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers. "Well, Jack," he said with a heavy sigh. "Congratulations. You've met a petty tyrant. In my 30 years of practicing law, I've found they're the most dangerous species in the suburban jungle. More destructive than termites, more persistent than crabgrass." "Can she really do this?" I asked. "Can she put a lien on my house for this?" "Unfortunately, yes," he said, his expression grim. HOA covenants are legally binding contracts. When you bought your house, you agreed to them. The associations are granted a surprising amount of power by state law. They can fine you, they can sue you, and they can place a lien on your property for unpaid dues and fines. And in a worst-case scenario, they can even foreclose on that lien. My stomach dropped. Foreclose? Over snow removal? "It's rare, but it happens," Thompson said. "These people get a taste of power, and it becomes a drug. They're often miserable people in their own lives, and this is the one area where they have absolute control. Fighting them is tricky. It's expensive. The system is often tilted in their favor because judges tend to see these as simple contract disputes." "So what do I do?" I asked, feeling a wave of hopelessness. Thompson leaned forward. "We don't roll over. We fight back. But we don't fight her on her turf. Arguing about the interpretation of a snow removal bylaw is a losing game. We need to go on the offensive. We need to scrutinize her." He tapped the thick file of papers I'd brought. "The first step is to demand a full accounting. As a homeowner, you are legally entitled to inspect the association's records. All of them. Financial statements, bank records, meeting minutes, contracts, everything. Let's see if our dear President Miller is running as tight a ship as she claims." He gave me a list of formal requests to make, citing the specific state statutes that compelled the HOA to comply. "She'll try to stonewall you," he warned. she'll charge you absurd copying fees, she'll give you incomplete records, she'll delay. Be persistent. Document every single interaction. Every email, every phone call, every registered letter. We're going to give her enough rope to hang herself with. I left Thompson's office feeling a strange mixture of dread and determination. The fight was going to be harder and more expensive than I had imagined. But for the first time, I had a strategy. I wasn't just reacting to Brenda's attacks anymore. I was going on the hunt. The investigation had begun. Armed with Mr. Thompson's legal guidance, I began my formal requests for the HOA's records. As he predicted, it was like trying to get secrets from a spy agency. My first certified letter, politely requesting access to the financial records for the past 2 years, was met with 2 weeks of silence. My follow-up email was answered with a terse reply from Brenda, stating that my request was under review by the board. Another 2 weeks passed. Finally, I received a letter informing me that my request had been approved, but that in accordance with another obscure bylaw, I would have to pay a records retrieval and copying fee of 75 cents per page, plus a $25 hourly supervision fee for the time a board member would have to spend watching me look at the documents. It was blatant obstruction, designed to make the process so expensive and difficult that I would simply give up. I wrote the check, my hand tight with anger, and sent it via registered mail. 2 weeks later, I was granted a 2-hour window to review the records at the community clubhouse. When I arrived, Brenda was there, sitting at a table with a single, thin file folder. "These are the approved financial summaries," she said, her smile thin and triumphant. The folder contained a few pages of high-level, useless budget summaries that told me nothing. "Brenda, my request was for all financial records," I said, keeping my voice level. "That includes bank statements, check registers, invoices, and receipts." "That information is confidential," she retorted. "We have a duty to protect the privacy of our vendors." "I have a right as a homeowner to see how my dues are being spent," I countered, quoting the state statute Thompson had given me. Her face soured. She knew I was right. "Those records are in storage. It will take time to retrieve them." This dance continued for months. I would send a formal, legally precise request drafted by Thompson. Brenda would reply with a delay, a new fee, or an incomplete response. It was a war of attrition. All the while, the notices for my own delinquency kept arriving like clockwork, the total climbing relentlessly. It passed $2,000, then $2,500. The letters now mentioned a specific date by which the HOA would be filing a lien with the county. The pressure was immense. My wife was losing sleep. We had conversations in hushed tones late at night, wondering if we should just pay it to make it all stop. But every time we considered it, I would think of Mrs. Gable, of Arthur, of the principle of the thing. Paying it would be admitting that Brenda was right. I couldn't do that. Finally, after a blistering letter from Thompson threatening legal action to compel disclosure, Brenda relented. Or rather, she made a show of relenting. I received an email instructing me to pick up the records from her front porch. When I arrived, there was a single, large cardboard box waiting for me. It was filled with a chaotic jumble of loose papers. There were no folders, no chronological order, just a maelstrom of receipts, bank statements, invoices, and handwritten notes. It was a document dump, designed to be so overwhelming and disorganized as to be useless. It was another one of her games. But it was the mistake that would ultimately be her undoing. That weekend, I turned my dining room table into a command center. I bought colored highlighters, sticky notes, and a case of coffee. I started sorting. For hours, I pieced together the financial life of Brenda's HOA. Slowly, patterns began to emerge from the chaos. And what I saw made the hair on my arms stand up. The first red flag was a company called Prestige Garden Solutions. The invoices from this company were astronomical. $10,000 for spring mulching and planting, $5,000 for common area pruning, another $7,000 for fall aeration and seeding. The invoices were vague, with no itemized breakdown of labor or materials. In the 2 years since Brenda had taken over, the HOA had paid Prestige Garden Solutions over $50,000. This was for a community with a single entrance that had about 10 shrubs and a patch of grass. Something felt deeply wrong about it. On a hunch, I went to the state's online business registry. I typed in a Prestige Garden Solutions. The company was, indeed, officially registered. It had been incorporated 2 years ago, just 2 weeks after Brenda had been elected HOA president. My heart started beating a little faster. I clicked to view the corporate filings. The registered agent, the official point of contact for the company, was a man named Martin Gable. That name didn't ring a bell. But the address listed for him did. It was in the next town over. I did a quick public records search on Brenda Miller. I found a list of known relatives. Her sister's husband, her brother-in-law, was named Martin Gable. I felt a jolt, a sudden, clarifying shock. It was a sham. The whole thing was a setup. She was funneling our dues to a company owned by her family. I started digging deeper into the box of papers, now with a specific target in mind. The checks written to Prestige were all there, signed by Brenda and the treasurer, Frank. The bank statement showed the checks clearing. There was more. I found invoices for legal consultation from a Miller & Associates law firm. A quick search revealed no such firm existed in our state. There were receipts for administrative supplies from an online office supply company I'd never heard of. I looked them up. The prices were 3 to 4 times what Staples or Office Depot would charge. It was a systematic, deliberate siphoning of the community's funds. The late fees, the fines, it all clicked into place. They weren't just about power. They were about revenue. My $25 monthly late fee, Arthur's $50 fine for faded shutters, the $25 extorted from Mrs. Gable, it was all going into the pot. A pot from which Brenda was paying her brother-in-law for non-existent or grossly overpriced landscaping work. She wasn't just a petty tyrant obsessed with rules. She was a common thief, cloaking her embezzlement in the language of bylaws and community standards. I sat there, amidst the piles of paper, the evidence of her crime spread all over my dining room table. The lien she had threatened to put on my house was no longer just an unjust punishment, it was an instrument of her fraud. She was using it to intimidate me into funding her family's illegal enterprise. The entire dynamic shifted in that moment. I was no longer the victim. I was the one holding all the cards. The frustration and fear I had been living with for nearly 2 years evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Brenda had started a war over a pile of snow. I was going to end it with a pile of evidence. My strategy was no longer defensive. It was time to go on the attack. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in November. In previous years, under Brenda's reign, it was a sparsely attended, tightly controlled affair. She would read from a prepared script, approve the minutes from the last meeting, declare the board members re-elected due to a lack of challengers, and adjourn. It was a pantomime of democratic process. This year, however, was going to be different. My first call was to Mr. Thompson. I laid out everything I had found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jack," he finally said, his voice imbued with a new level of respect, "you did it. You found the smoking gun. This is no longer a civil dispute about fines. This is evidence of criminal fraud and embezzlement." He advised me on the next steps. We needed to present this to the community, not just to the authorities. The power in an HOA, he explained, ultimately rests with the homeowners. We had to take that power back. My next call was to Arthur, the retired professor. I trusted him. He was level-headed, respected in the community, and he had his own reasons to be fed up with Brenda. I went to his house and laid the evidence out on his coffee table. He examined the invoices and the corporate filings, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, he looked up at me, his eyes blazing with a quiet, scholarly fury. "The woman is a crook," he said simply. "What do you need me to do?" Together, we hatched a plan. We couldn't let Brenda know what was coming, we needed the element of surprise. For the next 2 weeks, Arthur and I became quiet revolutionaries. We went door to door, not with flyers or angry speeches, but with quiet, concerned conversations. We spoke to the Millers, the family with the illegal vegetable garden. We spoke to the young couple fined for having a basketball hoop that was 2 inches too close to the street. We spoke to a dozen other families who had been bullied and fined into submission. We didn't show them all the evidence, that was for the meeting. We simply said, we have serious concerns about the HOA's finances and how our dues are being spent. It is very important that you come to the annual meeting. The seeds of discontent that Brenda had sown for 2 years were about to bear fruit. The night of the meeting, the small community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen more than 10 people there at once. Tonight, there were at least 70. People were standing along the walls and spilling out the doorway. The air was thick with anticipation. Brenda was at the front table with her 2 cronies, Frank and Susan. She looked flustered, annoyed by the unexpectedly large crowd. She clearly thought it was because of some minor issue, like a broken sprinkler head. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush. She tried to run the meeting with her usual iron fist, banging her gavel and demanding order. She raced through the opening agenda items, her voice tight. When she got to the budget review, she put a single-page summary on the overhead projector. As you can see, she said, our finances are in excellent order, thanks to diligent management. When she asked if there was any new business, I stood up. I have some new business to discuss, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. Brenda's eyes locked onto me. You are not on the agenda, Jack, she said dismissively. And as you are delinquent in your dues, you are not a member in good standing and have forfeited your right to speak. That was the moment Arthur had prepared for. He stood up, his voice resonating with the authority of a lifelong educator. Madam President, he said formally, I make a motion to suspend the rules and allow my neighbor, Jack, to address the community on a matter of urgent financial importance. Another neighbor immediately shouted, I second the motion. Brenda looked stunned. There is no need for a motion, she stammered. This is not proper procedure. Let us vote on it, Arthur insisted. All in favor of hearing what he has to say. Nearly every hand in the room shot up. Brenda's face went from pink to a deep, blotchy red. She was trapped. Her own procedural rules had been turned against her. Fine, she spat, banging the gavel. But be brief. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a laptop and a small projector. I connected it to the projector that Brenda had been using, replacing her sanitized budget summary with my first exhibit, a high-resolution scan of an invoice from Prestige Garden Solutions for $10,000. I'd like to talk about the budget, I began, addressing the crowd, not Brenda. Specifically, I'd like to discuss our landscaping expenses. I clicked through a slideshow of the invoices, totaling over $50,000. Murmurs began to ripple through the room. This seems like a lot of money for the small common area at our entrance. So I did a little research into the company we've been paying. My next slide was a screenshot of the state's corporate registry, showing the company name, the date of incorporation, and the name of the registered agent, Martin Gable. Now, that name might not mean anything to you, I continued, my voice steady. But a public record search reveals that Martin Gable is Brenda Miller's brother-in-law. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was staring at Brenda. Her face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I didn't let up. I showed them the fake invoices from the non-existent law firm. I showed them the receipts for the overpriced office supplies. I laid out the entire scheme, calmly, factually, with irrefutable documentation for every claim. I explained how the aggressive campaign of fines and late fees wasn't about maintaining standards, it was about generating the revenue needed to fund this fraud. She's been stealing from us, I concluded, my voice ringing with clarity. She's been taking our money and giving it to her family, and she's been using threats and intimidation to cover it up. The silence broke. The room erupted. It wasn't a riot, it was a wave of collective, righteous anger. People were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers. Brenda finally found her voice. "Lies," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is slander. All of this is fabricated. He's a disgruntled delinquent trying to get out of paying his fines." But no one was listening to her. Her authority had evaporated in the space of 5 minutes. Frank and Susan, the other 2 board members, were shrinking in their chairs, looking at her with horror and betrayal. "Brenda," Frank whispered, his voice trembling, "is this true?" That was all it took. The last pillar of her power crumbled. She looked wildly around the room, at the 70 faces staring at her with contempt. There was no escape. She grabbed her purse, shoved her chair back so hard it fell over, and stormed towards the exit. "I will not be subjected to this," she screamed. "You are all ungrateful." She wrenched the door open and disappeared into the night. In the stunned silence that followed her exit, Arthur once again took control. He calmly made a motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in Brenda Miller as president. It passed unanimously. He made another motion to freeze all the HOA's bank accounts, effective immediately. That also passed. Then, a man in the back of the room, a quiet neighbor I knew only as Mark, stood up. "I'm a retired detective with the county police," he said. "What I've seen here tonight constitutes probable cause for a criminal investigation. I'm calling the fraud division right now. The petty tyrant had been dethroned. The revolution was complete." The aftermath of that meeting was swift and decisive. The police and the district attorney's office launched a full investigation into the Whispering Pines HOA. With the evidence I had already compiled and the cooperation of the now terrified Frank and Susan, the case against Brenda was airtight. They uncovered even more than I had, finding a web of kickbacks and fraudulent charges that went back to her first month in office. She hadn't just been paying her brother-in-law, she had been using the HOA debit card for personal expenses, from expensive dinners to online shopping sprees, and disguising them as community expenses. Brenda Miller and her brother-in-law, Martin Gable, were arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The local news covered the story, running a segment with the headline, "Suburban Dream Becomes Legal Nightmare as HOA President Accused of Stealing Thousands." Her mugshot, featuring the same sour, indignant expression she always wore, was broadcast for all to see. The trial was a formality. Faced with a mountain of evidence, she was convicted on all counts. The judge, citing the egregious breach of trust against her own neighbors, sentenced her to 2 years in a state correctional facility. In addition, she was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, a sum totaling nearly $75,000, and serve 5 years of probation upon her release. To cover the restitution, a lien, an official, legal one this time, was placed on her house, and it was soon sold at a foreclosure auction. The irony was not lost on me. The weapon she had tried to use against me had ultimately been the instrument of her own downfall. My own vindication was just as swift. The interim HOA board, led by a reluctant but dutiful Arthur, held an emergency session. Their first official act was to pass a resolution dismissing, with prejudice, every fine, fee, and violation notice issued during Brenda's entire 2-year tenure. The $4,500 debt that had hung over my head for so long vanished in an instant. The illegal lien she had filed against my property was expunged from the county records. A few weeks later, I received a check from the HOA, reimbursing me for every penny I had spent on Mr. Thompson's legal fees. The community, through Arthur, insisted on it. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. It was like a cloud had lifted. People started talking to each other again, not in hushed, complaining tones, but as friendly neighbors. The Millers expanded their vegetable garden. The family with the basketball hoop lowered it back down for their kids. People painted their shutters whatever color they pleased. The oppressive atmosphere of anxiety was replaced by a renewed sense of community. I became, much to my chagrin, a local hero. People would stop me on the street to shake my hand or thank me. Mrs. Gable baked me an apple pie that was, without exaggeration, one of the best things I have ever eaten. It felt good, but it was also a role I was uncomfortable with. I had never wanted to be a leader or an activist. I just wanted to be left alone. I had simply refused to be bullied. The HOA was completely reformed. Arthur, with the help of Mr. Thompson and a committee of other residents, rewrote the bylaws from the ground up. The new rules were simple, based on common sense and mutual respect rather than control and punishment. They established strict transparency requirements for all financial matters, with the budget and all expenditures posted on a community website for anyone to see at any time. Dues were lowered by 30% as we were no longer funding a criminal enterprise. Whispering Pines went back to being the quiet, peaceful neighborhood it had always been meant to be, only now it was stronger. We had been through a fire together and had come out the other side more united than before. The beige mailbox rule was the very first one they officially repealed, an act that was met with a small, cheerful bonfire of leftover paint cans. 3 years have passed since that chaotic night in the clubhouse. Life in Whispering Pines has settled into a comfortable, peaceful rhythm. Arthur remains the HOA president, though he insists every year that someone else should take over. No one wants him to. He governs with a light touch and a sense of humor, which is all anyone ever really wanted. The community garden that Brenda would have paved over is now a source of pride, and on summer evenings, you can see neighbors gathered there, trading tomatoes and stories. Property values, which had stagnated under Brenda's reign of terror, have steadily climbed. It's a genuinely desirable place to live. The ghost of Brenda's tyranny has faded, becoming a cautionary tale that new residents hear about with a sense of disbelief. I did see her one more time. It was about a year ago. I was in a discount grocery store in the next town over, picking up some rock salt for the business before a winter storm. I was in the checkout line when I noticed the cashier. It was Brenda. She looked diminished. The helmet of blonde hair was gone, replaced by her natural gray, cut in a simple, unflattering style. The severe, tailored blazers she used to wear were gone, replaced by the store's drab, ill-fitting uniform. She looked older than her years, and the fire of indignation in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. Our eyes met for a brief second as I placed my items on the conveyor belt. I saw a flicker of recognition in her face, followed by a wave of what looked like shame. She quickly looked down, focusing on scanning my items. Her hands, which once wielded a gavel and a clipboard with such authority, fumbled with the bag of salt. She didn't say a word to me, not even the perfunctory "Did you find everything you were looking for?" I paid with my card, and she handed me the receipt, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. There was no apology, but there was no defiance either. There was just nothing. A void. I took my receipt and walked away. I didn't feel anger, or even pity. I just felt a quiet sense of finality. Her punishment wasn't just the prison time or the financial ruin, it was this. The quiet anonymity, the crushing irrelevance. She had lost the one thing she craved above all else, power. Sometimes, when a big snowstorm is in the forecast, I think back on the whole ordeal. It's strange to think that it all started with a simple act of neighborliness. It taught me a valuable, if difficult, lesson. It taught me that petty power, the kind wielded in small committees and local boards, can be just as corrupting as the grand-scale power you see on the news. It taught me that bullies thrive on the silence and apathy of good people. They count on the fact that it's easier to pay the ridiculous fine, to move the trash can, to just go along to get along. But I also learned that when one person finally stands up and says no, they often find they are not alone. There's a strength in community that a tyrant, no matter how determined, can never truly defeat. They can create fear, but they can't create loyalty. Their downfall is almost always of their own making, built on a foundation of arrogance and greed. This morning, the first heavy snow of the season began to fall. The fat, wet flakes drifted down, blanketing the world in a fresh, clean layer of white. I finished my coffee, pulled on my heavy boots, and went out to fire up the plow. The engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting growl. I lowered the blade and started down the street. The first driveway I cleared, as always, was Mrs. Gable's. She waved to me from her kitchen window, a warm smile on her face. I gave a short blast of the horn in reply. The sun was just starting to break through the clouds, glinting off the fresh snow. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and safe. I was just a guy who plows snow. And everything was exactly as it should be.